Time now for Restoring the Soul of Healthcare from the HELPcare Clinic in Austin.
It is that time here on a Thursday, and we welcome our friends from the HELPcare Clinic to the program. Good morning.
Good morning. Hey, good morning, John. Glad to be with you.
Good to have you here. Of course, that is Lee Acey and Dr. David Strobel. Wasn't sure if your other member was going to join us today or not, but good to hear from you. Lot to talk about here today, so I'll let you jump right in. And what is our topic du jour?
Well, sure. So, as you know, through HELPcare Clinic, what we're offering is, unlimited, unhurried primary care, no per visit charge through a membership, which is what makes it really an affordable and attractive option. But another big part of what we're doing is giving people tools and information to help them reclaim their own health, to help them, make lifestyle changes that can help to deal with some of the underlying causes and taking time, the ability for them to take time with their with Dr. Strobel or Stephanie Kimmis, who's our nurse practitioner, to really understand what's going on with their health. And so one of the things we want to talk about is coming back today, we had been talking a bit about metabolic syndrome, which is a condition that affects close to 90% of Americans to some extent. 50% really have metabolic syndrome, and others are just kind of on the way. And a couple weeks ago, we talked about blood glucose management and kind of how that's sort of the fundamental cause under a lot of this. And we thought, having Dr. Strobel talk a bit about how that can be managed through diet, and how carbohydrates really lead to some of those problems in metabolism. So, Dr. Dave, would you like to take it away?
I shall. So there's the way the body manages fuel for running everything is basically a couple different ways. One is by using carbohydrates as fuel, and the other is using fat as fuel. And there's a big difference between the two of these. Carbohydrates are water soluble, and fat is not. And since we are big bags of water, what that means is when you store fat, it doesn't take up very much space. If you store carbohydrates, it always is dissolved in water, and so the water that it's dissolved in takes up quite a bit of space. And so carbs are kind of like kindling, and fat is kind of like your log pile. And fat has more than twice as much energy in it as carbs do, so it's 9 calories per gram. And carbs have 4 calories per gram, basically. So what that means is that carbs take up a lot of space and they don't give you much energy, but because they're like kindling, they burn really fast and you can get your energy quickly out of them. And then what happens is we end up using up our carbs that are stored, and in order to maintain energy production, you switch over and start burning logs, to start burning fat. And so the problem is that we eat a diet that just has too many carbs in it. And carbohydrates come in 2 different varieties, simple and complex. The simple carbohydrates are called sugars, and the complex carbohydrates are called starches. And people often misunderstand that. They'll say, well, I'm cutting down on my sugars and carbs. Well, sugars are carbs. They're just short carbs, 1 or 2 sugar molecules hooked together. That's a sugar. Starches are long chains of sugars, so 3 or more hooked together, usually dozens. And so these have the same impact because you cannot absorb them unless you break them down into their individual pieces. So if you eat a piece of bread or you eat a tablespoon of table sugar, the impact on your blood sugar is going to be about the same total impact. The sugar will go in much faster. The starch will raise the blood sugar much slower, but for a longer period of time. But the total amount of sugar that goes into the blood will be about the same. So the key to the problem we've got is that we eat a diet that's too high in carbohydrates, and so we basically have too much sugar, too much starch in our diet, and we store all that we have room for. And then because we don't have enough room to store all this starch, then what happens is we convert the remainder into fat and store it as fat. Now, that doesn't take up very much space, but if you're always adding fat because of a high-carb diet, then it takes up more and more and more space, which is pretty evident just walking down the street. You can see that. And so then the question is, well, how do we burn that extra fuel rather than storing it? And the way you do that is basically by not eating too much of the kindling. So you decrease the carbohydrates in the diet. Those are sugars and starches. And then your body will say, gee, I'm out of kindling. I better walk over to the log pile and start burning some logs. And it'll do that as long as you knock the carbs down enough. And then the key is to look for the evidence that you're actually burning logs. And so the so-called smoke that happens as a result of that is ketones. So that's where the keto diet comes from. It's ketogenic. It generates ketones. And the way that happens is by burning logs. So you get rid of the kindling, you walk over to your log pile, you start burning logs for fuel, and you should be detecting ketones.
And
there's a little bit of a... Oh, go ahead.
I was just curious, what are we looking for? You say that you would notice that. How would we notice it?
Yeah, you have to measure it in some way. Some people can tell by the smell of their breath. Ketones are volatile, so you can actually smell them. Oh. So it's a good example of ketones is fingernail polish remover. That's acetone. That's a ketone. And so you can smell that. It evaporates well. And so one of the ways you can test for ketones is to get a breath ketone tester. You can buy these over the counter on the internet. They're all over the place. The classic way is to get urine test strips because you can detect ketones whether they're present or not by peeing on these urine test strips and see how that is. Or the gold standard is actually a device that checks your ketones in your blood and also your blood sugar in your blood and then calculates something called a glucose ketone index. And that can tell you the intensity of your ketosis.
Okay.
So those are good methods of being able to do it. So if you're cutting your carbs down and you're measuring for ketones and they are there, that means you are eating your fat. You're getting rid of your log pile.
Interesting.
There's another little twist, and that is that the third food that you can eat is protein, but protein is not fuel. Protein is building material. So that's like 2x4s. And so if you eat too much protein, more than you need to build tissues, maintain enzymes, that kind of thing, then you'll have a bunch of scrap 2x4s laying around that you're not doing anything with. Well, protein is also water soluble and takes up a lot of space. So what happens is if you get rid of your kindling pile and on your way to your log pile, you trip over a whole bunch of excess 2x4s that you eat too much of, then your body says, well, this is taking up space and he doesn't need it, so I guess I'll just burn that first. And so if you're eating a low-carb diet, but you're eating too much protein, you won't make ketones because you'll never burn the fat. So in many cases, people that have failure with the keto diet, they think that it's a high-protein diet, and that's not true. It's a low-carb, high-fat diet with just adequate protein. And you'll know if it's the right amount of protein by seeing if you're generating ketones. If you are, then you're not eating too much protein. If you're not, then you are eating too much protein, and you just need to back off.
It's absolutely fascinating because in a way, it's fairly simple to be able to manage all of this, but you need to do it the right way, and that's why you need to visit with somebody like yourself to kind of lay out that framework. But for us taking control or having that knowledge in our own diets is really helpful in getting us on that correct path and managing our health a little bit better.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and that's actually what we, when we talk about one of the services that we offer through HELPcare Clinic as part of the membership is health coaching, and helping people to figure out how to do some of these measurements for themselves, and also, with their food choices, to understand which foods have the right, blend of the carbs and the fat, and not overdoing on the protein. And what we'd like to say is it's really simple, but it's not necessarily easy. Because it's pretty straightforward. It's not too complicated to understand. I think Dr. Strobel just did a great job of explaining it. But then how do you actually live that out in your life, and how do you make the food choices day to day? And so providing some support for people as well who are looking to make a change, would like to, they've maybe tried some other things that haven't worked for them, but to give them support so that they can, in this environment that we have that's just loaded with carbohydrates and loaded with sort of eating all the time opportunities, how do you make those healthy choices that are going to contribute to your health?
Yeah, it seems like a lot of us can identify exactly what we're eating, whether it's I'm too much coffee in the morning, or we're having our Cheerios, or whatever it is. We know what we're eating. We just don't know what it's doing to us.
Right. And the knowledge is very powerful. You give people, talk about these complex things, but if you give them the power to be able to understand, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why do I need to change what I'm doing? Then it's up to them to do it. And our job is to provide information, answer questions, and be courteous and patient as people get to the point of, gosh, I better do something, and that's different for everybody.
Yeah, unfortunately, we are way out of time. Lee, if you could just remind folks how they can get signed up for the HELPcare Clinic, because we've got some deadlines coming up in the near future, I believe.
Yep. Yeah, we our early bird membership phase, which is 20% off our regular dues, goes through May 31st, and so people can call 279-2345. They can go to healthcare.health, or they can stop by and visit us at 308 4th Avenue Northwest. We're just a block east of St. Augustine's Church, and we'd love to show you around and have you get to see HELPcare Clinic for yourself.
All right, and we will get together again next week and continue our conversation about restoring the soul of healthcare. Lee AC, Dr. David Strobel, we appreciate your time. We'll talk to you next week.
You have a blessed day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.